Hey guys, welcome to Crafty Club Virtual Edition. Today we're going to learn how to make face masks. This is a really easy project we've got today, you guys, so don't worry if you're not an experienced crafter. All you need is a needle and thread and some patience to get this project done. Before we jump into things, let's talk about supplies. Now, I'll be making adult-size masks as the examples in this video, but if you need to make a child-size mask or if the dimensions provided for the pattern don't work for you for some reason, we're going to talk about how to alter the pattern we use later. The first thing that you're going to need is 100% cotton fabric. No matter what size mask you're making, you'll need at least 1/4 of a yard. Since most cotton fabric is about 45 inches wide and 1/4 of a yard is 9 inches, that'll give you a piece that's 9 inches by 45 inches. If you're doing the tie version of the mask and you want your ties to match the fabric of your mask, you need to account for that when you go and buy your fabric. Take whatever the width of your ties and add that plus maybe a couple of inches more to how much you need. Pick fabric that you like the feel of. The skin on your face is really sensitive and you're going to be wearing this fabric on your face for quite a long time, so you don't want something that's going to irritate your skin. In general, you should always pre-wash your fabric before you start working with it. With a project like this, it's generally not quite as important as something like a quilt would be, where if it shrinks after you do your sewing, it could ruin the entire thing. The amount of shrinkage you're going to get from cotton isn't going to ruin your face mask if you don't pre-shrink your fabric first. But please wash your fabric before you wear your mask. Even if the only other person besides you who touched the fabric was the person who cut the fabric for you and checked you out at the store, the fabric is not clean. It's been in warehouses and shipping containers and factories, and it's been handled by several other people that you didn't see. It's definitely dirty. It definitely needs to be washed. Now, we're going to be making two different versions of the face mask today. The first one we're going to make is the kind that loops around your ears with elastic, and then we're going to make the kind that ties around the back of your head with ribbons or with fabric ties. The steps for both versions are exactly the same until we get to the very end where we have to add in the elastic or the ribbon. So everyone should be able to follow along at the same time. Depending on which version you like best, you'll either need elastic or ribbon. The width of the elastic or ribbon is up to you, but I wouldn't recommend anything wider than 1/4 of an inch, especially for the elastic. You have a little bit of leeway with the ribbon in that if you get something that's a little bit too wide, you can always fold it over the top of your mask or fold it over and sew it down to itself. You can't really do that with elastic. Elastic's not as soft as ribbon, so it won't give. If you've got too wide of elastic, it's going to push down on your ear and cause some really uncomfortable pressure. And in a worst case scenario, it could cut into the skin where your ear meets your skull. And we really don't want that. Ribbon with some kind of texture to it is going to hold a bow better than satin ribbon, which is that shiny, soft kind of ribbon. The ribbon that I'm using has some metallic threads woven through it, so it's a tiny bit rough to the touch, but it's nothing that would irritate the sides of my face. It should hold a bow very well, and it should also grip onto my hair a little bit and help keep the mask from moving around. The next thing that we're going to need is something to measure our fabric with. The pattern that we're going to be using is just measurements that we're going to lay out directly onto our fabric. So a ruler is not optional. When I sew, I normally use something like a yardstick or actual measuring tape, like the kind you see draped around a tailor's neck. But for a small project, that would be a little bit too unwieldy. You're also going to need something to hold the mask together. You cannot use glue for this project, you guys. Glue is neither strong enough nor flexible enough to hold this mask together while you wear it. You must sew this mask. You can use any kind of thread that you want to use for this project. If you've got some laying around, that's perfect. The thread that I'm going to use for this project, I already had laying around. It's not regular sewing thread. It's a bit finer. It's serger thread. So I wouldn't normally use this if I was doing something like making a bag or a dress that needs to hold up to a little bit of stress. But for something like this, it's perfectly fine. If you have something like this laying around and you're not sure if it's strong enough for you to use, feel free to just go over your stitches once or twice. and that should make up for any deficiencies with the thread itself. This is also true if you've had this thread laying around for a while and it's a bit older. Sometimes thread can brittle as it ages. Of course, you need to cut your fabric, so you need scissors. If you are a crafter, you probably have some fabric-specific scissors laying around. If not, regular scissors will do. You're also going to need something to make marks on your fabric with so you can see where your mask is going to be. You can use anything you want. A regular pencil works just fine. That's what I normally use. If you've got kids, you can use one of their washable markers or colors. If you do use something like a pen or a marker, make sure that it'll wash out of your fabric before you go to town on the project, because you don't want lines on your finished mask. So just cut a little corner off of your fabric and make a mark on it with what you want to use. Throw it in your next batch of laundry, and once it's done, check and see if you can see any ink residue. If you can, you might need to find something else. If you can't, you're good to go. I'm going to use chalk for this video. Chalk is really awesome for drawing on fabric. It's super cheap. It's super easy to find. It comes in a lot of colors. And unlike pens or markers or colors that sometimes have trouble making a mark on smooth or silky fabric, or are really hard to see on those dark mid-tones, chalk is always very easy to see, and it always marks on any fabric. If you are worried about the colored chalk staining your fabric, then stick to really basic colors like white, or try and find a color close to the fabric that you're using. This next piece is optional. If you would like for your mask to have an adjustable nose piece, you need something to hold the nose piece's shape. I use twist ties. They are fairly easy to get a hold of. You can find them in the party supply section of most craft stores. You could also use jewelry wire or something like pipe cleaners. If you use jewelry wire or pipe cleaners, make sure you twist them in a way that the sharp ends aren't exposed so you don't accidentally poke yourself in the cheek while adjusting your mask. Like I said, this is optional. You don't have to put an adjustable nose piece in your mask, but an adjustable nose piece in your mask will help it fit better to your face, which means you'll get a better seal, which means the mask will filter better and it'll serve its purpose. You might hear me say wrong side or right side of fabric during this video. If you've never worked with fabric before and you've never heard these terms, basically what that means is which side of the fabric has the pattern on it. The wrong side, or the back side of the fabric, usually is washed out if you can see the pattern at all. A lot of the times you can't. The right side, or the front side, is the side where the pattern is vibrant. The colors are bright and the lines are crisp and you know what you're looking at. If you were looking at a t-shirt, the right side of the fabric would be the side that had the design on it, and the wrong side of the fabric would be the side that's inside, close to your skin. I recommend that when you're drafting out your pattern, you make your marks on the wrong side of the fabric. If for some reason the pen or pencil or chalk that you're using does leave behind a mark when you didn't expect it, it'll be much less visible on the wrong side of the fabric. But sometimes it is more convenient to make your mark on the right side of the fabric, and sometimes it's unavoidable altogether. You'll see me make some marks on the right side of my fabric closer to the end of the project. It's recommended that masks be 4 layers thick of 100% cotton so that you can get the thickness for a filter. So you're either going to need 4 pieces that are measured to the size of your mask, or you need 1 piece that you can fold 4 times to get the amount of layers that you need. I prefer to use 4 pieces cut to the size that I need them. I find that it's much easier and it will save you a little bit of your nicer patterned fabric. When the mask is finished, the 2 inner layers won't be visible at all. So if you use your nicely patterned fabric to make all 4 layers, you're going to lose what could potentially be the front and back layer of an entire other mask. I like to use something plainer, just like plain white cotton, or something I already have laying around in my fabric stash that maybe got stained with a marking pen or isn't something that I ended up liking. Now, I want to remind you guys that this mask is an adult size mask. I'm going to give you the dimensions to make an adult size mask first, and then talk a little bit about how you could go about resizing this mask for a smaller face or a larger face. For an adult size mask, we need a rectangle that's 8 inches wide by 7.5 inches long. This includes seam allowance. Now, if you don't know what seam allowance is, when you sew something, you can't just add your stitches to the very edge of the fabric, especially when you're working with a natural fiber like cotton, which tends to fray as it's being used. Your stitches would eventually just fray right out of the fabric, so you need to leave a little bit of room for them to grab onto. That's what seam allowance is. These measurements include your seam allowance, so you don't have to add anything extra. If you prefer to use your own specific measurement for seam allowance, then the base measurements of the mask without seam allowance are 7 inches by 6.5 inches. My seam allowance included is a 1/2 inch on each side, and I like to keep a little bit of extra room in my seam allowance because I like to finish my edges. This is optional, and you don't have to finish your edges if you don't want to, because they'll be hidden inside the mask when everything is over, but I like the extra strength that it gives the edges in the end. You can see the seam allowance visually represented by the space between the dotted rectangle and the solid line rectangle in the image on your screen. When your mask is finished, it should be about 7 inches wide and about 4 inches long when all of the folds are pressed flat, and about 6.5 inches wide at the middle point when it's all stretched out. If you need to make a mask for a child or somebody with a bigger face, or even just a more narrow face, then you'll need to measure that person. Measure them from the tops of their cheekbones just outside of the corner of each eye to get the width. Then measure from about the middle of the nose at the bridge all the way down to just under the chin. If you'd like to add some length to your mask as a personal preference, you could do that. If you like your mask to be a little bit longer than the width of your eyes, you could do that as well. Just don't forget to add seam allowance to your measurements. 1 inch is a good rule of thumb. That will give you my preferred seam allowance of a 1/2 inch all the way around. Now we can start cutting. Mark out your mask on your fabric in your preferred method. Again, I like to make 4 squares in the size that I need them. So I'm going to cut 4 squares that are 8 by 7.5 inches. I've also cut a long piece of fabric so you can see what it would look like if I was going to just take one long piece and fold it so that it's 4 layers thick. If you want to go this route, then you'll need to remember to remove your seam allowance measurement from your measurement. So instead of taking 7.5 inches and multiplying it by the 4 layers I need, I used 6.5 inches to multiply by the 4 layers that I need, and then add my seam allowance back to get 27 inches. Now, I took my seam allowance out before I multiplied by 4 because there is only one bottom seam still. You only need to add seam allowance once. You can see in the image on the right that I have my 4 pieces already cut out, but only one of them is of the teal fabric that you've seen so far. The 2 middle layers are cut out of a white fabric that I had in my fabric stash at the top of the image, and the newspaper print at the bottom right hand side is for the other side of my mask. Now, I did this because it's recommended that when you make these masks, you make the front and the back sides different so that you can always wear the same side next to your mouth. This helps to prevent any accidental contamination. If you have your mask on and you took it off earlier today while you were in the car and both sides are the same, you might put it on where the side that had been facing your mouth now is facing the outside. Say you reach up to adjust your nose piece while you're in the grocery store. Well, any germs you might have breathed out onto the side facing your mouth earlier are now on the outside, and you've just touched them with your hand. Even if you have a glove on, you still will transfer those germs to the handle of the cart when you put your hand back. So if you know which side is supposed to be the inside, then you can always wear that side next to your mouth, and the other side should remain relatively germ-free. Once you have all your layers together or your one solid piece cut out and measured, we need to stack up the layers. Now, if you have an iron handy, then it would be a good idea to keep it where you can reach it so that you can periodically press your fabric during this project. Pressing your fabric as you go helps to keep everything all nice and flat. The flat fabric will line up better than wrinkly fabric. Unfortunately, since I'm doing this project at work in the library, I don't have an iron nearby, so my fabric is wrinkly, and I apologize for that. We're going to stack our fabric with the two inner layers that you don't want to be visible at the bottom, with one of the outer layers on top, with the right side facing up, like in the picture on the left. With the remaining outer layer, we're going to lay it so that the right side is facing down, so that the right sides of the two outside layers are touching each other. In the right-hand image, you can see that I folded back the corner of the topmost layer so that you can see the front side of the newspaper print that's most visible, the right side, is touching the right side of the teal fabric. When I fold the layer back down, the wrong side will be what I'm seeing, and that's the side that I'm going to make my stitches on. Once your fabric is lined up the way you want it, press it so that it lays flat, and if you have them, go ahead and use some straight pins to pin the fabric together so that the layers stay in place. If you don't have pins, that's okay. Just be extra careful when you pick up your fabric sandwich to sew it. Sew along the top and the bottom sides. These are the sides that are 8 inches. You'll leave the 7.5 inch sides open for now. You can see in the image above that I've already gone over my edges with a zigzag stitch. And if you look in the corner on the left side, the dotted green lines are where my straight stitches are going to go. You don't have to do a zigzag stitch on the edge if you don't want to. I just happen to like the way that it looks. If you want to add a nose piece to your mask, then this is the step that we'll do that in. If you don't want to add a nose piece, then you can skip forward just a little bit. If you're adding a nose piece, you need to mark the center of your mask. You can do this when you measure it out, or you can fold the mask in half and make a little mark on the fold with whatever pin you're using, or if you have your iron nearby, you can fold the mask in half and then press it, and when you open it again, there will be a crease where the middle is. Whatever method you're using to make your nose piece adjustable, you'll need to mark the center of that too. I like to take my twist ties and fold them in half. Since there's a piece of metal in the middle, usually surrounded by some kind of thick paper or wax paper, it usually leaves behind a crease. If the crease is too hard for me to see, I'll mark on it with a little pin. You can see the center mark that I made on the mask before I put my stitches in the image above. Now, when I add a nose piece to my mask, I like to use more than one twist tie. Usually I'll use about 3, sometimes 2. Twist ties aren't totally uniform. Sometimes your twist tie might be the same width as another twist tie, but the metal in the middle won't be in the same place. And sometimes a twist tie might be longer than another twist tie. I like to make sure that my twist ties are stacked together so that any metal pieces that aren't completely in the center are laying next to each other to help give a better coverage. You can see in the image in the top left corner 2 small gray dots in the middle of the red paper. That's the wire running through the twist ties. You can see that they're lined up, but the wire is not in the middle. I like to pin my ties together so that they don't move around while I'm trying to secure them on the mask. You could tape them together also, or you could just secure them each individually. The twist ties are rather small and kind of slippery, so I do recommend finding some way to keep them in place while you sew so that they don't end up crooked. Match up the center marks on your twist ties with the center mark of your mask. Make sure you place your twist ties in the seam allowance area. You don't want to put your twist ties below the stitches you used to sew the top and the bottom of the mask. When you turn your mask inside out, your twist ties will be the new top of your mask, and the top of your mask will then be uneven and it won't be long enough. So you need to put your twist ties in the seam allowance. Any stitches you make to secure your twist ties will then be hidden and it won't affect the overall length of your mask. When I secure my twist ties to my mask, I like to do a straight stitch at each end, and that's what primarily keeps the twist ties in place. I don't sew all the way down the length of the twist ties with my straight stitch because this increases the chances that I will hit the metal and the twist ties with my sewing machine needle, which could chip it or break it. And if you have ever accidentally broken a sewing machine needle mid-project, it can be kind of scary. This isn't really an issue if you're sewing down your twist ties by hand, since you have a little bit more control over when your needle goes into the fabric versus it automatically doing it on a sewing machine. Once I've done my straight stitches at each end of the twist tie, I like to go back in and do a zigzag stitch around the twist tie all the way down. Now, when I say around the twist tie, I mean I center my zigzag stitch over the middle of the twist tie, and I start at one end and go to the other end. And as the needle goes down, it doesn't go down into the twist tie, it goes down right next to the twist tie. So the twist tie is being secured by putting the thread on each side of it, kind of like its own little hammock. Now we need to flip our mask right side out again. Since we only sewed the top and the bottom, the sides are open, so our mask is currently a tube, kind of like a t-shirt. Like you would if you're going to put on a t-shirt that was inside out, flip your tube so that the right sides are facing outwards. If you've been ironing as you work, now is a good time to press the project again. The first time we pressed it, the mask was inside out, so everything was set in that position. Now that we've turned the mask right side out again, it's not flat anymore. So go ahead and press it so that it lays nice and flat and everything's lined up again. Even though I'm not able to press my fabric since I don't have an iron, you can see how nice and neat the seam looks since we sewed it from the inside. I zoomed in on the image on the right so that you could see that even this close, it's very hard to see your individual stitches, which gives the mask a really nice finished look. Since the mask looks so nice and polished on the top and the bottom ends, I want my sides to look the same. This is optional if you don't mind that your sides look a little rough or you like the look that the frayed cotton gives the mask. You can skip this step and you can trim off the side seam allowance. But I'm going to finish the sides of my mask because I like that look better. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mark out the 1/2 inch on each side for my seam allowance. Now, I told you I was going to make a mark on the right side of my fabric earlier, and this is one of those instances where doing so is completely unavoidable. There is no wrong side of my mask anymore. I have the front side and I have the back side, and both of those are the right side of the fabric. So I picked a chalk color that is complementary to the mask, but is also easy for me to see. The light green doesn't look bad on the teal. Now, as I'm recording this, I'm actually holding the mask that I'm making currently in the video. I've taken it home and it's been washed, and it's actually my mask for the day at work today. The chalk came off the teal side entirely, and it came off the back of the white side as well. But in the folds that you'll see me do later, where the detergent may not have gotten to soak in as well since they're done so tightly, there's a little bit of staining. This will probably fade the more times that I wash this mask. It's only been washed a couple of times because I've only worn it a couple of times. But it's only visible from the white side and only visible from the side of the mask itself, and if you didn't know what to look for, you would not be able to see it. When I put my mask into the wash, I did not expect to pull it out with a mystery stain. Now, you saw earlier that my twist ties that I used for this mask were red. This was a mistake. Red dye tends to not be as stable as most other colors. That's why you see so many movie tropes and cartoons about someone throwing a red sock into the wash and everything coming out pink. It's not an exaggeration. It will happen. And the dye from the red twist ties seeped into the dye on the white side of my mask. So now there's some red splotches at the very top. It's not a big deal because it's the inside of the mask, and I don't normally use such a light color fabric on the insides of my mask, but the newspaper print was what I had available at the time. So if you want to avoid this, just make sure you don't pick a twist tie color that you won't like if it bleeds into the wrong side of your mask, or just avoid red twist ties entirely. So you need to mark your seam allowance, and once you've done that, you can even up the edges if there's any discrepancy from any minor shifting that happened while you were sewing earlier. You can see in the image that the white sides and the inner layers, which I do normally cut a little bit bigger than the outer layers for this exact purpose, are sticking out a little bit. I'm going to trim those up, and you'll see that in the next image. What you're looking at here is the inside of your mask tube. You can see that there's 4 layers on the left-hand side, and in the right-hand side, you can see that I have divided them evenly to the 2 sides. You can also see that I have trimmed my messy edges in this image. Now you want an outer layer on one side and an inner layer on one side so that the middle is between the 2 inner layers. This helps keep everything symmetrical. You don't want to put too much bulk on one side of the mask or the other because then it will look odd. You won't be able to really tell why it looks odd, just that it looks odd. You'll have to take my word for this. To finish the side edges, what we're going to do is fold the edges down along the line that we made when we marked out our seam allowance. We're going to fold them down into the middle of the mask. We're not going to do each individual layer. We're going to do all of the layers at once. If we did each individual layer, that would be a lot of extra work, and it would make the edges look bulkier than they need to be. I like to start folding at the top seam and the bottom seam and then make my way around. Fold down your edges on that line as best you can. It's okay if it's a little bit uneven. We're going to fold the sides of the fabric anyway, so it won't be noticeable. If you have pins, pin them down as you go, making sure to keep your pins parallel to your fold. This way you won't accidentally poke yourself as you're sliding your hand around the inside of the tube, and when you sew, you won't have to preemptively pull out your needle and stop every time as you get to one. You can just go right over it. If you're ironing as you go, just iron down as you fold and you won't need to pin at all. You can see in this image that I have finished folding all the way around this side of my mask. Since my mask is still a tube and the folds are on the inside, it kind of looks a bit like a pillowcase from this angle. Do this for both sides and go ahead and make sure everything is pinned or ironed as you need it to be. Don't sew it yet. If you want to sew the sides down so you can remove the pins before you put the folds in, make sure you don't sew the 2 sides together. Your mask still needs to be a tube so that we can put the elastic or the ribbon in. We're going to learn how to do the elastic version before we do the ribbon version. If you want to do the ribbon version, don't skip ahead because the process is almost exactly the same. The only real difference is that you need 4 pieces of ribbon versus 2 pieces of elastic. I'll tell you how to make sure that your ribbon is the correct length after we finish the elastic version, but the process to put the folds in the front of the mask and everything else is exactly the same. For an adult-sized mask, you need 2 pieces of elastic for each side that are about 7 inches. If you need different length elastic because you aren't doing an adult mask or you've changed your dimensions slightly or for some other reason, then you need to measure the elastic against the face of the person you're making the mask for. You don't need to have a finished mask to do this. You can use the mask piece in progress that you already have. If there are pins in your mask, either take them out or make sure the ends are hidden away in the fabric or not pointing towards the face so that you don't accidentally scratch the person you're measuring or yourself if you're doing this mask for yourself. You'll need to figure out where the sides of your mask will be once your mask is finished. Now, this sounds more difficult than it is. All you're going to have to do is hold up your mask to your face. Your nose piece is already in your mask, so you can go ahead and pinch that to the bridge of your nose in the spot you want it to sit. Then stretch out the sides to see where they're going to hit your cheeks. Make sure that you've already folded your sides down and pinned them in place, or you've already trimmed off any seam allowance that you don't need to finish the sides of your mask. If you don't make sure that your edges are folded or trimmed before you measure out your elastic, then the elastic piece that you measure is going to be too short for your mask. Remember that your seam allowance is going to disappear, so that's an extra ½ inch that your elastic needs to stretch that wasn't accounted for when you measured it out, which means your mask is going to be too tight and it might be too uncomfortable for you to wear. Once you have an idea of where the mask will sit when it's finished, you can measure your elastic. Take your elastic and put one end at the edge of the mask. Try not to overlap the elastic with the mask more than 1 centimeter or 2, really just enough so that you can hold it in place. You don't want to overlap it too much or it'll be too long. Loop the elastic around your ear and bring it back to meet the mask on the bottom edge. Then cut it where the elastic and the edge touch. This should be a length that's long enough for you to use for your custom mask measurement. It also includes your seam allowance. Since we didn't stretch the elastic when we measured it, taking away ½ inch, or whatever your preferred seam allowance is going to be, will make the elastic stretch when we put it on. This will provide the tension that we need to hold the mask onto our face and give us a seal that will allow the mask to function as a filter. Measure and mark out your seam allowance on each end of each piece of elastic. Then insert the elastic into your tube, making sure that the mark for your seam allowance lines up with the edge. Try to put the ends as close to the top and bottom seams as you can so that the top of your mask or the bottom of your mask isn't falling over and flapping in the wind. Once your elastic is secured in place, you can sew the sides of your mask. Try to keep your stitches as close to the edge as possible. Now, I know I said earlier that when you sew, you can't just sew right on the edge because your stitches will fray out. But our seam allowance didn't get cut off, it just got folded under, so there's plenty of fabric for our stitches to hold on to, which means that we can sew right on the edge. The last step of this mask is going to be adding the folds in the front. Some masks have 2 folds and some masks have 3. The one that I make has 3 because it was based off a mask that I got at my doctor's office, and that mask had 3 folds in the front. I don't use any particular measurements to place my folds or find where they need to be. I just kind of do what looks best. Lay your mask down on a flat surface and pinch the edges so that you have a little hill of fabric. Then take your little hill of fabric and fold it down towards the bottom. Pin it or iron it in place. You can see that the first fold is already done. You want to start your fold down a little bit from the edge of your mask rather than right at the edge of your mask. Play around with how much fabric you pinch and how close together you do the folds until it looks the way you want it to. It's okay if they're not completely symmetrical or totally uniform as long as they're there. You do, however, want to try and make sure that the lines you make when you fold them down are as straight as possible. Otherwise, your mask will be uneven at the bottom. You can see my second fold isn't exactly the same as my first fold, and that's okay, but the line is straight. So my mask is going to be the correct length all the way along the bottom. Once you have all your folds in place, this is what the side of your mask should look like. Try and make sure that nothing is sticking out at an awkward angle and everything is folded as neatly as possible. This isn't vitally important to the integrity of your mask and its function, but it does make it look nice at the end. The folded edges are fairly thick. There's no way around this. You're having to fold 4 layers of fabric onto each other. So take your time when you sew. Once you've secured the front fold, you are done with your mask. Make sure that you wash your mask before you use it and wash it after each use. Your mask should be wide enough to cover you cheek from cheek, and it should stretch out enough that it sits below your chin and covers your whole face. The twist ties do a great job of holding their shape when you adjust them. I find that I don't have to adjust my mask too terribly much once I have set my twist ties in place. Of course, if I move the rest of my mask, I have to adjust it then, but most of the time, it does a really good job keeping its shape and it stays where I need it to. Now we need to learn how to do the ribbon version. Like I said earlier, the steps are almost exactly the same. The only difference is that you need 4 pieces of ribbon instead of 2 pieces of elastic. To figure out how long you need your ribbon, what you're going to do is take your ribbon still on the spool that it came on and wrap it around your head and tie it in a nice bow. Make sure that you're tying it in a bow, not in a knot, because a knot is harder to get out at the end of the day, especially if it's in the back of your head and you can't see it. You also need to make sure that you leave tails at the end of your ribbon after you've tied your bow so that you don't have to struggle to have enough real estate to tie your bow. Once you've figured out the length that works for you, you'll cut that length off the spool. Use the one you've already cut to measure another piece the same length and cut that off as well. Then you'll cut those 2 pieces in half to get the 4 pieces that you need for your mask. Now, I know some of you might be saying, why did I just cut the ribbon that ties around my head in half? Well, since the pieces are going in the sides of the mask, they need to be tied behind your head, which means each individual piece doesn't need to be long enough to go all the way around your head, just long enough to meet its partner in the back of your head. Place the ribbon in the mask tube just like you did for the elastic. Try and keep it close to the top and bottom seams, but make sure that the ribbon is laying flat and it doesn't accidentally get folded over. Then sew the sides of your mask down and add your pleats in. If you decided to go ahead and add your pleats in before you added your ribbon in, then you can go ahead and finish off your mask. And that's it. You are all done. Now you can make as many masks as you need, and you can have masks to match every outfit in your closet. If you have a uniform for work, you can have a mask to match your uniform if you so choose. You can customize these masks however you want to. You can change the width or the length. You can add cool trim. You can do whatever you feel like would make your mask stand out or blend in. Play around with it and have fun, and if you do make any masks with this tutorial, we would love to see them. So feel free to share them with us on social media. That's it for this virtual edition of Crafty Club, but don't worry, we've got more projects coming up for you, so stay tuned, and we hope to see you soon. Thanks so much for watching.